You may notice that I'm not James Brooks. He's a little bit taller, more handsome, all that. James is feeling under the weather and he felt his voice wouldn't hold up. So yesterday he asked me to do this. So understand, trying to move through. And what we're going to talk about today is the book of Hosea from the Old Testament, one of the quote-unquote minor prophets. Not because they're less important, it's because their books tended to be short, succinct, and focused, okay? But I wanted to comment a couple of things before we got going. First of all, today's sermon was very impactful, and for anyone who has had anything to do with Dallas Seminary, that's their rallying cry of 2 Timothy verse 17, 18, about what the Bible is good for, right? And in fact, if you think about what that verse says, that's basically the foundation of Dallas Seminary, because Dallas Seminary is known as being an Bible expositional training center for pastors, and that verse basically says it all. And story was, some of you might know Pastor Jeffers, who's First Baptist Dallas. We were at a fundraiser for Dallas and he was the speaker. I thought that was unusual because he's leading the big Baptist church. But he said when he was in college, he determined he was going to become a pastor. And so he went to his pastor, who was the Baptist pastor of Baptist pastors, not Childress, I'm trying to think, somebody, Criswell. He went to Criswell and he said, I'm thinking about becoming a pastor. What should I do? And Criswell looked at him and he said, well, if you want to be a Southern Baptist pastor, you have to go to a Southern Baptist seminary. But if you want to learn how to teach the Bible, you have to go to Dallas. So he did both. So anyway, but yeah, God-breathed is so important, and I thought he did a great job on explaining why we believe the Bible is God-breathed and why we need to believe it. And I'm going to start off this morning, and it may be no surprise for those of you who may have gone through the Open Bible Academy. Last night we had our annual banquet. But we're in the second unit, and it's called Understanding How to Read and Study the Bible. And we use a inductive learning system, which says you start with what? Observation, observation, observation. Then you go to interpretation and finally come out at application. And essentially the way it's defined by the teachers, it's about 60 to 65% of your time should be spent on observation. Observation of the passage that you're working on. So this morning I'm starting just on the first chapter of Hosea. But observation in what we train on is, what is the background of this book? What do we observe about the book going forward? So that's today. And remember, I always like to kind of remind you of this. A mature believer has a strong understanding of the Bible. The Bible is more than stories about Jesus, but a lifetime guidebook and tool. And realistically, in expositional learning like you're doing, the intent is not that you take it all in and just feed off of it, but you take it all in and figure out how to give it out and how you can impact others with what you've been learning. And as a teacher for OBA, my entire focus is to build up my students so they can go out and teach others. And I recite that to them because I want them to take it in and grow and then actually go and do it. And one of my favorite comments I got from one of my students, I was asking them why they were there, why they wanted to learn. And this woman said, I have 4 children and I want them all to know the Bible. So I'm here so I can teach my children. And hopefully more than that. So, and as James likes to say, you know, with your Christian life, you're either progressing or regressing, and this is what we talk about. As a refresher, the last time I taught a series on the post-exilic books of the Bible, the last books of the Old Testament after the people had returned from the exile in Babylon. And we're going to reference that today in Hosea. But this is the piece I put in your handout just to show the time frame of the Old Testament. And apologize if this is too redundant, but I like to specify you have to understand when things happen in order to effectively understand how the Bible operates. And for the Old Testament, what we want to start off with would be the day of Abraham converting and being accepting of the Lord's guidance, which was about 2,000 years before Jesus, right? About 2,000 years before Jesus. And then when we get to the Exodus, you can see on here, it's 1446, not quite 500 years before the end of that century. And as it works around, the key dates become when David rules, right around 1000 BC, and then toward the end, we see the northern kingdom being conquered in 722, and the southern kingdom going into the Babylonian exile in 586, and then the temple being rebuilt. So the Old Testament period's pretty straightforward. We've got the patriarchs, we've got Moses leading the people, and 40 years in the wilderness. And the question you always have to ask about that is, why 40 years? Why 40 years? And there's a couple of key points there. The first one is that when they wouldn't go into the Bible with the first of the spies, 10 spies said, no, 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 they're too big, we can't conquer them. The determination by God and Moses was basically that this generation is not the generation we want to go and conquer the land that we've been promised. And so they all died off in the desert. There's only two that didn't, Joshua and Caleb. All the rest died in the desert. The other reason is that he had to bring the people from a position of really not being followers and believers. When they left Egypt, they hadn't practiced circumcision or any of the rules that we later see. And so God had to build into the people the law that was given to Moses. And one of the keys we have to understand is God believed and passed to Moses that the people had to gather as a community on regular times of the year to build up their strength in their faith in Yahweh. And so that became the three major holidays that were celebrated where they had to come, if possible, to the temple in Jerusalem, right? So the first one we have is Passover, the second one is Pentecost, and the third one is Sukkot, or the tabernacles. And the reality is they're both religious holidays, like Passover, celebrating the saving of the people getting out of Egypt because of the Passover where the Egyptians' first sons died. But also, that was the planting celebration. That was when the agricultural year started. That was when the agricultural year started, and they were blessing and praying for God for a good harvest. We don't have 80 to 90% of our people being farmers these days. In fact, in America, with all of the modernization and machinery, I think it's like 2% of the population are actually farmers or ranchers. But back then, everybody was pretty much a farmer to a great degree. And so, blessing for the good harvest to start off. And then Pentecost is known as also first fruits. In other words, it's the first growth that's coming up agriculturally, and some of that can be harvested, but basically, again, it's thanking God that we're going to have a good harvest. It's coming up now. And then at Sukkot, the tabernacles, it's the celebration of the harvest. And in modern Jerusalem and around Jewish communities, if they're Orthodox, they build a sukkah, an actual place outside of their home, and they eat there, and many of them will sleep there, I guess except if it's raining. So, but if you're in Jerusalem and you look around during Sukkot, all the balconies on all of the apartment buildings all have little dwellings that have been built on the apartment building patio or terrace where they're going to celebrate Sukkot together. Okay? And then we see the same, right? Pentecost, or starting off, Passover is the weekend that we have for Christ's Passion. And first fruits, or Pentecost, we know as the giving of the Holy Spirit. So we have these parallels. We don't see them as agricultural, but they did. They absolutely did. So when they came into the land, it was divided up, and they went into taking over to being farmers again, and instead of being in the wilderness. And then when we get into the kings, of course, we have 3 kings where the kingdom is pretty united, and then, gosh, after Solomon, it all goes to pieces, right? And we end up with 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom, we looked real carefully and decided there were absolutely no good kings. In 250 years, there were 0 good kings. And you'll see that today. And then in the southern kingdom, there were a few, Hezekiah and others. So we see this nation splitting up and then going on, and it comes to 722 BC, and the Assyrians, that we're going to hear about today, come and send the northern kingdom into exile. And what happens? They don't return. They do not return. And then in 586, we see the next being the Babylonian exile, and they did return. And there's a hint of this in the passage today. So for those of you who might recognize this, who is that?
Peabody and Sherman.
Who is it?
Peabody and Sherman.
Right. Mr. Peabody and Sherman. And what do they always say? Set the Wayback Machine for the year, and this is going to be the year 750 BC. Okay? 750 BC. And this is when Hosea was in his ministry. Okay? And this is the first verse. Word of the Lord came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and the reign of Jeroboam, actually Jeroboam the second, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. We're going to see that that's a bit of an understatement, but this is the first verse, so it's setting the stage. Who's the author? It's Hosea, son of Beeri. When did he do this? During the reigns of those kings. And the Israelites, the Jews, were fanatics about history and maintaining history. That's why we have both Kings and Chronicles to give us, and Samuel to give us the history of the people. So we know the years that these kings became king and died, right? I haven't heard of too many kings retiring back in these days. Pretty much they just died, or someone helped them on that, right? There's an awful lot of help on that basis. Anyway, so this is the time we're dealing with. It's directed actually at the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, and this is one of the commentaries that I found. It says the central announcement of the prophet Hosea can be summarized in one short sentence. God promises to do what human beings ought to do, but cannot. What they ought to do, but cannot. God of Israel, Yahweh, is revealed through the prophecies of Hosea, and he has an ongoing love story with the people of the covenant. So we can see Hosea as a love story. We can see it as a prophecy of judgment. We can see it as a prediction of various things that are going to happen in the future, both for the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, right? Prophecy only is valid when? When it comes true, right? Prophecy is only good when it comes true. And what Hosea prophesied about, it came true. So, the powerful forces of this day. This is from 2 Chronicles. The Lord had humbled Judah because Ahaz, king of Israel, had promoted wickedness in Judah and had been most unfaithful to the Lord. And I'm not good on this name, but it's Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came to him, but he gave him trouble instead of help. Ahaz took some things from the temple of the Lord and the royal palace and presented them to the king of Assyria, but it didn't help him. Okay? What we're talking about is Assyria as an empire and a kingdom. And as Craig Reynolds said this morning, you know, the reality of the Bible keeps getting proven again and again. 100 years ago or 150 years ago, people believed that Assyria was a fictional idea from the Bible until British archaeologists found Nineveh, right? Until they found Nineveh, it was believed this is just some fantasy that was in the Bible. But they found Nineveh. This is what it looked like, they believed, back in the day. Very huge city. And we have this other story that involves Nineveh, right? The fellow with the whale, right? Working to understand. So we see Nineveh both in the essence of Assyria as a rising empire, and we see it as Jonah being sent to try to get them to repent. And he was successful, right? How many of the prophets were really successful in getting the kings of their day to repent and change, right? Any? I think he's it, right? He's the only one, and he got mad about that, right? Okay, the Assyrians were not nice people. They had a habit of, after they conquered a town, they would cut everybody's heads off and pile them up like this to warn the next city that they should cooperate, right? They were really not nice people. At this time, what we're talking about is first of all, in 750, as we took the Wayback Machine, at 750, this was a time of affluence and success for Israel and Judah. They were doing well. People were happy, successful, believing that God was blessing them and keeping it going. Except they weren't following God. They were following Baal and other idols and things like that. But this shows the distance here. There's Jerusalem, Joppa, and you can see Israel to the north, Judah to the south, and the arrow leading to Nineveh. And remember, when we talked about Abraham coming from down on the Tigris Euphrates, you didn't go straight across because that was the great desert. You had to go up and around. And when we talked about Ezra and Nehemiah coming to Jerusalem from Babylon, it was 3 weeks or more, or 3 months or more, I'm sorry, that it took for them to get there because it was such a long distance. That's right. So what we're talking about now is this is the time where things are really good in Judah and Israel, but at the same time, Assyria is growing in power and strength. And here's Jonah, right? Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because it's wickedness. And Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. Went the other way, right? He went the other way. Interesting thought about this is, if we go back to the map, the whole deal with Jonah was he was swallowed by a whale, right? He was swallowed by a whale. Does Nineveh look like it's near an ocean? right? Nineveh is way over there. It's not near any ocean. So obviously the Mediterranean was the site of the whale. But he had a pretty long hike after he got out of the whale, right? It wasn't like it was near the sea. So who was this Tiglath-Pileser, right? Neo-Assyrian emperor from 745 to his death in 727. So this is while Hosea is the prophet, while he's prophesying to the northern kingdom being no good kings, and the northern kingdom being a larger, obviously larger group, 10 tribes compared to just the 2. But he ended, as it says, a period of Assyrian stagnation, introduced numerous political and military reforms, and doubled the lands under Assyrian control, which included the movement down toward their biggest enemy, who was Egypt. So we have Egypt on the map to the south, Assyria to the north, and Israel being in the middle. It's not a good place to be between two big warring countries. Because of the centralization of their territory and the standing army, some researchers consider his is really when Assyria became an empire. Okay? So here we are in Israel, happy and content, feeling wealthy, having some military successes, and then little do they know that this empire that's to the north of them is getting bigger and badder and stronger. And, you know, if they'd had Facebook, they'd have heard about it, right? If they'd have had modern technology, they'd be hearing about, you know, all the Assyrian victories. But instead, they kind of get surprised on this whole thing, right? And then they try to appease the Assyrians, like previous verse. So here's Hosea. Probably lasted from 760 BC until sometime during the reign of Hezekiah, who came to be king in 715. So he was ministering for quite a long time. And the book is broken up into this introduction that we're going to look at today, and then a series of oracles, a series of charges against the people of Israel, the northern kingdom. Although they believe he probably lived there, but that was his focus rather than the southern kingdom. While the early part of his ministry, period of affluence and success, it ended with the Assyrian exile in 722. So he saw the whole thing. He was prophesying, hey, you got to clean up your act. God is not happy. And ultimately, what he prophesied came true in 722. And interestingly enough, he lived through the reigns of 4 kings in Judah, the southern kingdom, which he mentions in the opening of his book, and actually 7 kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. There they are. 4 kings of Judah. And if you read any of the information that you find about these kings, it always says Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, Ahaz, son of Jotham, Jotham, son of Uzziah. It doesn't always say that in the northern kingdom, right? You might note that Zechariah was their king for 6 months, and Shallum lasted 1 month. Now, I'm not sure, I haven't read up on all of these folks, but I suspect that foul play might have been involved here, right? The turnover, there are at least 3 what we would call different reigns in the northern kingdom. In other words, it wasn't always father to son, but sometimes a cousin came in and killed everybody and became the king, and then his son, and then some other cousin came in and wiped them out. So it was very, very evil and very, very unpredictable. And by the time you get down to Pekahiah and Pekah, you're seeing that the Assyrians have now, with their new strength under Tiglath-Pileser, have come in and basically made the northern kingdom what we would call a vassal state. They were giving payments to the Assyrians to keep them from wiping them out. And when the payments didn't come through on time, they came and wiped them out. And that was that. So, but Hosea gets to span this whole time with all these various kings. And then it gets real interesting in the second verse. The Lord began to speak through Hosea, and the Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for an adulterous wife, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So he married Gomer. Now, remember, we know another Gomer from TV land, right? But that Gomer is a he, not a she. Always wonder who named him, right? That's almost like a boy named Sue if you really read the Bible. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Okay. So here's the big controversy, right? Here's the big controversy. This is a holy nation, right? Even up till today, I may have said this before, when the Arab Muslim peoples fight against the Jews from Israel, they speak two different languages. But the people, in rededicating a Hebrew language, decided they would have no curse words or anything like that. So when the Israeli soldiers are facing off against folks from the opposition, they use the same swear words. Kind of an odd thing. So they understand what they're saying, at least in that regard. At this point here, the real controversy is, if this is a holy nation, what's he doing marrying a prostitute? Right? What's he doing marrying a prostitute? So, right, this is from Dr. Constable. At the beginning, Hosea's ministry, Yahweh commanded him to take a wife inclined to infidelity and have children of infidelity. This was an unusual command because people were committing flagrant infidelity in the sense they had departed from the Lord. So Hosea is saying, go marry a woman whose tendency is to run after other men and marry her and have children with her, and you'll be a mirror image of what my people are doing to me. All right? That's the whole point. But there's this controversy about, was she a prostitute before he married her? Oh my gosh, this is a holy nation with men that are supposed to be, and he's a prophet. He's not a priest, but he's a prophet. So we come to this whole idea that there's 4 theories about what this means, which I find interesting. And this is all from Dr. Constable. First one was, Hosea just had a vision that showed him his wife was becoming a harlot, right? Hadn't happened yet, but he had this vision. The second one was that she was actually an idol worshiper, but her harlotry, her prostitution was to idols, not physical prostitution. Again, not that strong of an idea. The third one was that she was promiscuous before she was married. Maybe she was even a temple prostitute. And finally, Hosea's wife became unfaithful after they had married. And this is the most like what has happened with Israel, right? In the desert, Moses sat him down and said, the Lord has commanded me. Will you follow me? And as a group, they all said, yes, we will, we will, we will. And if you go into Deuteronomy and you kind of look at it carefully, there's probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 chapters of what happens if you follow the Lord. And maybe 16 chapters of judgment if you don't, right? It seems to be skewed on that side. Maybe God knew something was going to happen. But there's all kinds of judgments in Deuteronomy about what will happen to you if you don't. And James asked me to include this. He said in this class at one point, they talked about the proleptic view regarding Gomer and Hosea. So The proleptic view basically says that God never contradicts his moral standards, and that the focus is on Gomer's unfaithfulness after marriage. And that is most aligned with what has happened to the people of Israel. Starting off, we're there with you, we're going to go conquer the land. Come on, Joshua, let's go. And then ultimately, through Judges and on, there gets to be a pulling away from the Lord. Hosea's marriage is viewed as a metaphor for the relationship between God and the people of Israel. And this isn't just the northern kingdom, this is all of them. So Israel originally was in a right relationship, thus the harlotry of Gomer. Anybody ever use that word these days? You know, it's like certain words in the Bible you don't find in literature anymore. Right? Harlotry is not, maybe if you're reading Old English literature or something, but I don't read harlotry very often. But it must have been after marriage, and falling away of Israel is shown up as that's what he's condemning. His purpose was announced that the nation had broken Yahweh's covenant. Remember, when James teaches us on the covenants, the one covenant that is a bilateral covenant was the Mosaic covenant, right? Moses, based on what God had told him, says, we're going to have a covenant, you're going to be our God, and we're going to be your people. And the people agreed. So it was based on both sides having a participatory part of this thing, that God, yeah, I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. And here's the rules. Go read Deuteronomy again, right? Deuteronomy is essentially a repeat of Leviticus, maybe a little bit of Numbers. But again, it's reinforced that this is how you will be my people. This is how you will act. By the time we get to 750 BC, which is, what, 600, 700 years? 700 years later? Yeah. 445 to 750, about 700 years. Things have really gone downhill, right? Things have really gone downhill. Idol worship is prevalent. And here it says, his purpose, Hosea's purpose, was similar to Jeremiah's purpose, that both prophets announced and witnessed the downfall of their respective nations, right? With Jeremiah, it was, of course, Judah, the southern kingdom. With Hosea, it's the northern kingdom of Israel. The people needed to repent and return to the Lord and his covenant. If they did, they might avoid judgment. Judgment's on its way, and they haven't maybe understood that the Assyrians are headed their way. When the Assyrians came, they took a majority of the people in the northern kingdom, especially the leaders, into captivity. But they didn't stop there. They kept going. They headed down to Judah. And who was the king of Judah at that time? Hezekiah, or his predecessors. And they stopped the Assyrians one night with the help of the Lord. So the issue becomes, what's the difference? We'll get into that. The names are extremely important in this, right? The names are all very symbolic. Hosea is actually a variation on Joshua, which is where we get Jesus from, and basically he's saved. So Hosea is trying to be the one who says, if you follow me, you'll be saved. His wife Gomer, her name means completion. And I'm not fully sure how we ought to interpret that, but there's that. And then his three children, right? Jezreel, God sows. Lo Ruhamah, she is not loved. And finally, my favorite, Lo Ami, not my people. Do you have any friends who have named their children "not my people"? Right? Or anything even close to that? Right? This is kind of fun stuff, I think. So the Lord said to Hosea, "Call the son Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I'll put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel." Jezreel was a community, but it also was the valley of Jezreel. And if you look at a map of Israel, it's a triangular shaped valley. The wide end at the east is the Jordan River, and it comes to a point kind of near Mount Tabor, where we've had different things happen. But Jezreel is famous for who? King Ahab and his wonderful wife, Jezebel. Anybody have friends who've named their kids Jezebel? You know, that kid might have a tough time, right? It's almost a boy named Sue kind of thing, right? So the important point about this child is that the place is a place that is demonstrated that those people were not following God. The house of Jehu murdered Ahab and all of his family, right? And then, of course, Jezebel had her deal with Naboth and had him killed, and then she had this untimely end as she was run over by, I guess, numerous chariots. It sounds familiar. Do you have any familiar ideas of dentists in Houston that got run over by their spouse? Right? Yeah. We refer to it as death by Mercedes. Anyway, so the son was called Jezreel, and there were the two key things. The killing of King Ahab and Jezebel by King Jehu. And then Jehu later killed King Ahaziah and 42 relatives. Sounds like a busy day. So this is showing the disrespect of God. The idea that I taught you to be a people who cared for others. I taught you to be a people who understood how to live together. And this doesn't seem to be working. And then Gomer gave birth again and called her Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved. And Hosea is quoting God saying, "For I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should forgive them." Okay? If we look at the Old Testament, one of the key words that everybody kind of struggles with is a word called chesed, which in most translations comes out as loving kindness. God never loses his chesed for his people, his creation, but he pulls back his protection, essentially, is what's going on here. And then in verse 7, it's the contrary. Yet I will... Okay, we'll try that again. I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but I, the Lord their God, will save them. So here in Hosea, we're seeing that Israel is finished, and they're not coming back. But we got a different conclusion for Judah, right? So she's not loved. Yahweh was telling Israel he would no longer have compassion for their sins, for her sins. Yahweh would not save them from the consequence of their sins and failures. He still has his hesed, loving kindness toward Israel, but he's not going to protect them, right? He's not going to protect them. And Judah will somehow be saved. The answer after 586 is there's an exile, but the people would be maintained as a group, and some would return, and they do. And then she had another son, and called him Lo Ammi, not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. And this is essentially a recitation from Exodus, right? In Exodus 3:12, God made Moses promise, I'll be with you, and this will be a sign that is I have sent you. And then in chapter 24, the people sat there and agreed to the Mosaic covenant and then continued to break it. I would say they maybe got, 30, 40 years that they were really strong on this, and another 700 where they were falling away. It's the story of people, isn't it? It's the story of people. And then at the very end, we've got 2 verses that say, essentially, despite the judgment, God returns the idea that some people will survive and thrive. Some people will survive and thrive. Hosea's words are crucial, understanding his theology of hope. There's got to be hope. I, your God, I, Yahweh, still believe in you. You're still my people, and I will find a way to give you some hope. Now, many of them probably were slaughtered by the Assyrians, and we know many were slaughtered by the Babylonians, but there was a remnant, always a remnant. The nation's unfaithfulness to God and their trust in Assyria, which they were trusting Assyria was going to take care of them, would be their downfall. But God would preserve a people, and out of them would spring an innumerable multitude. You know, the interesting part is, in the Bible we read about Assyrians, we read about Babylonians, we read about, all the ites, right? The Midianites. How many of you know a Midianite, right? How many of you know a Babylonian? There are people actually who say they're Babylonian. But realistically, the Jews are still with us, right? 4,000 years later, there's still an intact remnant of the Jewish people that started when Abraham said, I'll follow, right? Interesting. And then finally, here's the verse. Yet Israelites will be like sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called children of the living God. And this is kind of an implication of what's coming. But then the next one really says it to us. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together. They will appoint one leader and will come out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. If they come back together and they only have one leader, I'm nominating Jesus, right? The people will come back together and there will be one great leader. And one of the things we've been overlooking on this that I haven't mentioned is Jezreel, the valley of Jezreel, leads us to a term because the one city there is called Megiddo, and the valley of Jezreel is known as the site of Armageddon, right? So this is a really impactful place in northern Israel, and it may be impactful as far as those who are following at the end of the Bible what's going to happen there at the valley of Jezreel. So in spite of the promise of real judgment, Hosea is offering a glimpse of the future where the 2 nations would come together, and we consider that that future king will be Jesus, and it's a messianic prophecy. And this is from Jeremiah, right? Their leader will be one of their own. Their ruler will arise from among them. I will bring him near, and he comes close to me. For who is he who will devote himself to be close to me, declares the Lord. So in the first chapter of this book, in 10 verses, we have 3 kids with really strange names. We have a sense that marrying a prostitute turns out to be essentially a warning to the people of the land of Israel, the northern kingdom. And at the end, there's still hope. There really is still hope as far as Hosea is expressing. So, the major concepts, the people of Israel had sinned against God and he was abandoning them to their fate. The Mosaic covenant had been broken through all their sins. And Yahweh would treat Judah more kindly because they were not as sinful. They were sinful. They were just not as sinful as Israel. Okay? So we see the future going ahead and coming true through Hosea, who's doing this around 750 BC. What's Hosea trying to give the people? Right? Warning of judgment. And the oracles that fill the book after this are one idea of judgment after another, describing the sins of the people and why God is going to abandon them if they don't change. And as we read Jeremiah and we read Isaiah and now we read Hosea, the chances of them changing don't seem to be particularly good. The people of Nineveh changed, but the people of Israel and Judah don't change. Right? And finally, Hosea's words are crucial to an understanding of his theology of hope. His prophetic oracles appear to presage absolute judgment, but that was only for this unbelieving generation. The nation's unfaithfulness to God and their trust in Assyria would be their downfall, but God would preserve a people, and out of them would come an innumerable multitude. So we must ask, does this make any sense today? Do we have any things that seem to be happening around us that Hosea might identify with? Does this look familiar? Right? Understanding that, as I said about my trip to India, that my Indian pastors were subject to real persecution and beatings. It's not a pro-Christian world out there. Not necessarily even here.